In 1962, a 30-mile drive northwest of Moscow, surveyors began marking out streets in an empty stretch of forest. The plan was extraordinary in its ambition. The Soviet Union intended to build, from nothing, an entire city dedicated to a single purpose. It would design and manufacture the microelectronics that would let the Eastern Bloc leap ahead of the West. They called it Zelenograd, the Green City. On paper, it had everything an American chip town did not. Funding by the billions, the full backing of the state, and a clean slate of land with no inconvenient market to answer to. Compare that to what was happening on the other side of the planet at exactly the same moment. In California, a loose cluster of engineers, refugees, and restless misfits was inventing the integrated circuit in rented buildings between apricot orchards. They had quit their employers in anger, raised money from skeptical financiers, and were quietly rewriting the rules of electronics. Nobody ordered them to do it. There was no city plan. There was no decree. The two experiments could not have been more opposed, and the outcome would expose something that no central committee had thought to measure. The men who pushed for Zelenograd were not fools. Two of them, Philip Starros and Joseph Berg, were defectors who had worked inside the American electronics world and understood exactly what made it tick. They argued that microelectronics was the future of warfare, of computing, of everything. The Soviet leadership agreed and gave them what looked like a blank check. And that was the first and deepest flaw. The American industry had grown because nobody could control it. Zelenograd was built on the opposite belief, that the future could be commanded into existence by the right ministry with the right budget. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what a chip factory actually needs. It is not one machine or one genius. It is a web. It needs ultra-pure chemicals from one supplier, precision optics from another, photographic masks from a third, testing rigs from a fourth, and engineers who move freely between companies carrying ideas in their heads. In Silicon Valley, that web assembled itself messily through people quitting, competing, and gossiping over lunch. The whole region behaved like a single organism that nobody owned. Zelenograd tried to grow that organism inside a single fenced compound, all of it reporting upward to the same ministry. Here is the difference that no amount of money could fix. In the West, if your chemical supplier shipped you a contaminated batch, you fired them and bought from a competitor the next morning. In the Soviet system, there was no competitor. There was one assigned supplier, fulfilling a quota set in advance, with no reason to care whether the product actually worked. A factory could not refuse a bad shipment because the bad shipment was the plan, and the plan was the law. Quality became somebody else's problem, passed down the line until it reached the chip itself, where the defects could no longer hide. So the Soviets reached for the obvious shortcut. If they could not grow the ecosystem, they would simply steal its products. Through a vast and well-funded espionage operation, agents acquired Western chips, machines, and documentation by the crate-load, smuggling them through neutral countries and front companies. Engineers in Zelenograd would take an American microprocessor, slice it open layer by layer, photograph every detail, and reproduce it. They became, in a strange way, the best reverse engineers on Earth. Entire Soviet chip families were direct clones of Intel and Texas Instruments designs, copied transistor for transistor. And it almost worked. Almost, but copying has a built-in delay. By the time agents acquired a chip, smuggled it home, analyzed it, and tooled up a factory to reproduce it, years had passed. The West had already moved 2 generations ahead. The Soviets were running a race in which they could only ever react to where their rival used to be. Worse, a copy is only as good as your ability to manufacture it, and their factories, fed by those indifferent suppliers, could never match the yields. They would copy a chip, designed to be made by the millions, and struggle to produce a few thousand that worked. There was a deeper trap hidden inside the strategy of copying. When you reverse engineer someone else's design, you never have to understand why they made the choices they made. You inherit the answer without the question. So when the original design hit a wall and the Western engineers solved it by inventing something genuinely new, the copiers had no path to follow. They had built their entire system around imitation, and imitation cannot lead. It can only trail. The men who decreed Zelenograd into existence had assumed that the hardware was the secret. The hardware was never the secret. What Silicon Valley had that no spy could photograph was its culture. The freedom to fail and try again without disgrace, the right to quit your boss and start a rival firm next door. Venture money willing to bet on a wild idea. A flow of immigrants and outsiders bringing strange perspectives. Open argument, public competition, and the constant churn of people and capital looking for the next thing. None of that fit on a microscope slide. None of it could be smuggled in a diplomatic pouch. It existed in the relationships between thousands of people who were free to act on their own judgment. Zelenograd had the opposite of all that. An engineer could not quit and start a company because companies could not be started. There was no venture capital because there was no capital that did not belong to the state. Failure was not a learning step, it was a political danger, something to be hidden from inspectors and superiors. Information did not flow freely, it was classified, hoarded, and rationed. The very things that made the city secure made it sterile. They had assembled all the bones of an industry, and then forbidden the one thing that brings an industry to life, which is the unsupervised movement of people and ideas. The results showed up in the numbers, slowly and then all at once. By the late 1980s, Soviet microprocessors lagged their Western equivalents by something like 5 to 8 years, and the gap was widening, not closing. Soviet personal computers, when they existed, were heavy, scarce, and built from those troubled clone chips. The consumer electronics that flooded Western homes simply never arrived in Soviet ones. The city that was supposed to out-invent California had become a museum of borrowed designs, always one step behind, perfecting yesterday's breakthrough while tomorrow's was being argued out in a foreign coffee shop. And then the country that built it ceased to exist. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the funding that had sustained Zelenograd evaporated overnight. The factories that could not survive without the plan now had no plan at all. Some of the talent scattered abroad, taking the one truly valuable thing the city had produced, which was its trained people. The buildings remained. The institutes remained. But the grand experiment, the attempt to legislate an industry into greatness, was over. What survived did so by becoming, at last, something closer to an ordinary set of companies competing in an ordinary market. So why did a city designed to copy Silicon Valley produce almost nothing of lasting consequence? Not because the Soviets lacked brilliance, they had it in abundance. Not because they lacked money, they spent fortunes. Not even because they could not build the machines, they could and did. They failed because they tried to manufacture the fruit of a culture without growing the culture itself. They wanted the chips without the chaos, the innovation without the freedom, the ecosystem without the disorder that makes an ecosystem alive. You cannot photocopy a culture. You can only photocopy what a culture has already made, and by then, it is already old. Zelenograd still stands today, a district of Moscow with quiet streets and aging institutes, a monument to a question that every ambitious government keeps asking. Can you order innovation into being? The honest answer, written in concrete and silence on the edge of a Russian forest, is that the most valuable thing about Silicon Valley was the part nobody could see, copy, or control. It was never the silicon. It was the messy, unplanned, ungovernable human network around it, and that was the one thing the planners could never build, no matter how perfect the blueprint.
If you found this deep dive valuable, hit the like button, drop a comment below on what tech mystery we should decode next, and subscribe to never miss an episode.